Hey y'all, welcome to the Clock Tower. I'm Colton here with Brandon. 2020 is almost done.
And there was much rejoicing.
There was much rejoicing. With the year wrapping up, it seems appropriate to talk about the year that has been, the events that did happen, the products that were released, and ultimately what that means going into 2021. There's a lot that happened in 2020. And because of COVID-19, we didn't have any major tournaments sanctioned by Bushiroad after the World Championships at the beginning of the year. But we did have the Weiss Schwarz Invitationals, so that gave us a look at some of the stuff that was released in the first 6 months of the year. But the big headline of 2020 is obviously going to be no competitive events after Worlds.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't have any official tournaments, either Springfest or even just the 2020 season for Worlds. So we're looking into spring season with a question mark as to whether or not we'll even have it.
And if we do have it, it is entirely possible that we could be playing our tournaments online. A lot of things still on the table for 2021. But with 2021 looming, let's take a look back at 2020 and the year that has been in the Weiss Schwarz English game.
Yeah, because we're going to look at the Worlds event from 2019 that kind of concluded in January. We saw 36 decks brought to the tournament itself, just kind of demonstrating the breakdown a little bit of that, what that looked like. Some of the decks that had the biggest showings being Attack on Titan, Bang Dream, Konosuba, ReZero.
Coming into 2020, the boogeyman of the meta was still Attack on Titan, right? It wasn't something that you were always playing into, but it was a significant chunk of what was topping events, and Worlds were no exception. It was the most representative deck at Worlds, but it still didn't even make up a quarter of the meta, and only one of them actually ended up cracking top 8. Riaz won with AOT, there were 3 Konosuba lists, a couple of ReZeros, Davita's Card Captor, and a Bang. That's kind of the world that we were in when 2020 began. And with that, we got into the release schedule for 2020. And the first major release of the year was one of the most anticipated and at this point is probably one of the most debated in terms of its place in the meta, and that's Goblin Slayer. Came out in January, was expected to make a pretty big splash at the top of the meta, got played a lot, very mixed bag of results.
Yeah, well, I think part of it also, the expectation, I think there was some for Springfest that Goblin Slayer was going to do really, really well. I think part of it also is the idea that it didn't get a chance to shine in its own meta, if that makes sense, where it was the new man on top.
Yeah, it was supposed to be. It really felt that the initial list with that initial Priestess top end, most of the meta kind of figured out how to play into Goblin Slayer and really punish it for its lack of a finishing game. And there have been some lists that have had some success. And we'll get to this, later on. Broderick had some success with, and then Vince's list that pivots off the level 3 combo entirely and just really leans into healing mechanics did well in the card market tournament a couple of weeks ago. Goblin Slayer still has a lot of players, and we're going to continue to see it, but overall, it definitely hasn't had as big of a presence in the meta as I think it was initially thought to have on release.
Yeah, I would say that definitely Goblin Slayer, if we're looking at it now, as opposed to, when it first released, I think it was threatening deck. I think that maybe a little bit overhyped in some of its abilities. Because the potential of Goblin Slayer, I think, is really, really high. However, when it comes into practice, it takes a very experienced hand to be able to navigate it effectively, which we've been able to see have happen. And even experienced hands have run into struggles with this deck.
I think that the reason Goblin Slayer hasn't been able to really take that step into being a top tier meta contender is mostly just that end game. It just doesn't close games. It doesn't really have that kind of finishing mechanic, and with the exception of Vince's card market list, that really leans in more towards the healing and doesn't try to loop that Neg Soul combo. I think that this is a set that is always going to be handcuffed.
If we look at the Priestess Neg Soul combo, one of the big issues that runs into, the fact that the Priestess combo can miss. even on combo.
Yeah.
When the card attacks, revealing the top card, whether it's the character or event, which hits all but 8 cards of the deck. But by that time, as you're trying to compress yourself and trying to get lower and lower, if you reveal a climax, it doesn't get the neg soul. And that neg soul becoming a problematic thing, it actually seems to almost, in some ways, help your opponent to be able to modulate their damage.
Yeah.
So that way they can then stick the damage that they need to on a compressed deck. So like it,
Right.
in many ways, it backfires if it doesn't do its full thing.
Let's be real. There are so many decks that just don't finish games with vanilla soul damage. So neg souls are nice. They decrease your opponent's damage floor. It takes a lot of them to be an effective defense strategy. The wall strategy has not seen as much play because it hasn't been working as effectively in the meta. And that's just in terms of results, right? This is not, but in any case, Goblin Slayer is definitely here to stay as part of the meta. It will be played. It's very popular. People like it. There will be some good players like Vince and Broderick who can take it and do good things with it and win events with it. But I think that on the whole, this is going to be a pretty small slice of 2021.
And I think its age is showing a little bit here. We'll talk about this in a little bit too. But I think that wall strategy may come back in a little bit, but it'll come back in a somewhat different form that may be a little bit more effective. So we may still see that strategy kind of reapply itself, but in a new light and a little bit more consistent. So I think it kind of opened the door for a potential wall system. So the next one up on the list that came out was Alicization for Sword Art Online. Off-traded from the majority of the rest of Sword Art Online, so very much kind of like standalone in its own way. We've seen it played in the WSI, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and it did fairly well, also in the hands of Riaz, who won Worlds. It's definitely an interesting deck. It has a strong finishing combo, runs the trial deck, typically level 1 combo.
It doesn't seem to be as popular among players as the old Sword Art stuff. The old Sword Art was well represented at Worlds. You couldn't throw a rock without hitting a Sword Art deck. And now the release of Alicization doesn't really, and this is just, playing local events, observing other broader events. It just doesn't look like there are a lot of people playing Alicization by comparison to how many people were playing the old SAO stuff.
Well, I think part of that also ties into the idea that it came out right before quarantine happened. Because this was, February? Coming in at essentially the wrong time. I think we should talk about this just briefly, that this set will be getting support in JP.
Yeah.
The possibility that it'll come to English, I think, is rather high.
I think so too. Sword Art is still popular in English.
Yeah,
it's still a popular franchise. People are still watching what season 3 just wrapped up, and it got a movie release. Sword Art is still a very popular North American property. People will buy it because it is Sword Art. So I'd be really surprised if we didn't get Alicization 2 in English. And when we do, it's probably going to be off trait from the old Sword Art stuff, much like this is. But there's, like you said, there's a really good top end, pretty good level 1 combo. There's stuff in Alicization where a new Alicization set could really push it into meta territory.
It can definitely add that support this set lacks at the moment.
So next in release order, Jojos Bizarre Adventure. And I'm going to be honest, Jojos never felt like more than a meme. From its release, I don't remember any excitement about this set at a meta level. People like Jojos, they were going to play it because it's Jojos. And I remember on Reddit seeing posts of people like, hey, I'm a huge Jojos fan. I just picked up the trial deck. How do I play this game?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely had an opportunity to bring a lot of people in.
I think it definitely did bring some people in. I have no idea if they stayed. I also know that this happened, again, right as quarantine started. This set released, the week that the world went into lockdown.
Which gave a lot of people an opportunity to play.
Yeah, this set came out on the 27th. So, 2 weeks after quarantine began is when this set came out. People bought it.
Yeah.
Especially people outside of the traditional Weiss market were buying it. From the minute JoJo dropped, no one was talking about it as something that was going to compete. It showed up once at WSI, and we thought it was hilarious, honestly. Watching the stream, people were kind of rooting for JoJo because they knew it wasn't very competitive.
It was definitely the underdog, for sure.
I don't really have any issue with Bashiro printing sets that aren't as good. Like, I don't think that every set needs to necessarily get better. I think that that's one way you keep a healthy meta is, like, making sure that when you print something, it's good for a while. So, like, the existence of JoJo's as a sub-meta set is fine. And, the people who bought it seemed to enjoy themselves, which is ultimately what we're here for. So, but in terms of meta conversation, there's not much to say about JoJo.
As we kind of look forward to the next set that got released, Fujimi Fantasia Bunko.
This is another one of those sets that, like, big splash on release, but then post-release, it felt like it fizzled.
Partly because I think it has that same kind of idea that we talked about earlier. This deck wants to wall up. It wants to be a deck that maintains board and has board presence, and with the Neg Soul event, to be able to try to minimize damage dealt through the traditional means of swings, of attacking through frontal attacks. What that falls susceptible to is the variety of different ways that you can deal damage other than just direct attack.
Right, the odd attack burns, the combo damage, anything else, Musashi's, anything that isn't dependent on you hitting a vanilla swing, this is susceptible to. And, like Goblin Slayer, we didn't really talk about this with Goblin Slayer because it didn't, I don't think it was as big of a deal playing into Goblin Slayer as it was this, because Goblin Slayer just wasn't as big numerically in terms of its power numbers. Everything dies to removal, Brandon.
Yes.
If you just remove a card from the board by a wind effect or something else, it's not there anymore. People die when they're killed. Cards can't hurt you when they're not on the field. There was just too much removal tech. There were too many ways to bounce these massive 2/2s that sit at 13/5.
Well, I think that's one of the big things, is that with all of these different wall standby options out there, the inclusion of removal tech becomes more and more important to the deck building process. And when you do, and having them available at earlier and earlier levels, that allows you to be able to answer some of these problematic walls relatively quickly and with ease. So,
yeah. See live, date A.
We're not there yet, Colton. So this one, again, had that same kind of idea, that initial threat of, hey, this is going to be very, very strong. And arguably still is decently strong. Like, it's still competitive.
Oh, sure. I think it's going to be really interesting when Data Live drops in 2021 in English. There will be cards from this set that are playable with Data Live, and there are a couple of really choice tech pieces in there that are going to make DAL just that much more oppressive in 2021. It'll be interesting to see how that goes. In terms of 2020 performance, it showed up once at Invitationals. It was another one. So this and Alicization were both picked up by Worlds finalists. It was really one of the things we were watching going into the Invitational was how were these sets going to do in the hands of such gifted players. So while Riaz took Alicization pretty far into the tournament, Lamb had trouble getting Fujimi off the ground. It still gets played. In terms of its future role in the meta, I don't know. Like, again, it's the presence of so much removal. I think it caps it at a certain level, but it's certainly going to get played. And, if it's playing into something that struggles to get big things off the field or struggles to get over big numbers, then, it'll maintain its field. It'll build hand, build resources, and, it has a pretty good end game. It'll show up. It'll be present, and we'll continue to see it played in 2021, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Especially if you're not prepared to see it, it can definitely come back to haunt you. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on as we look forward. We should point out at this point in time, this is when WSI happened. Recognizing that WSI was not Springfest, it was not a true replacement of that, but recognizing that this did happen, and it did happen with some very prominent members within the community.
It was almost certainly the most competitive event in the 2020 season.
I just wanted to point out that the one competitive event, as competitive as it gets, happened at this point in time. Mm-hmm. So all of the other decks that we'll look at as we close out the rest of the year, all of the other decks happened post that.
Yeah, and I don't know if anyone remembers this because it happened so long ago, because time is a flat circle. But we did videos pretty much every day for about 3 or 4 weeks during the summer covering this event. If you want to know in detail what happened in those games. Link to the description.
Link to the playlist of videos that said, "Hey, this is what kind of recapping each of the games." If you want the full games, those are available through the WSI page, YouTube channel. They have a playlist of all of those videos as well.
We'll link that playlist in the description as well. But long story short, without getting into all of that, Heaven's Feel, which showed up at Worlds, but was not particularly well represented. Only 3 decks were there, and I think a lot of people attributed that to the fact that it was newly released. It had only come out a few weeks before Worlds, so it existed, but people hadn't had as much time with it. So it was printed, it was there, it showed up, it didn't top at Worlds, but 6 months later, it rolls into Invitationals, and Matt takes Invitationals with a resounding win in the final against Konosuba.
Yeah, pretty much.
Fate went from, we think this is really good, but it was still pretty unproven. The best players thought it was going to be very present. Over the course of a few months, it wins the closest thing we have to a major event post-Worlds in 2020.
Yeah.
I don't think that the meta necessarily revolves around Fate now, but I think that the biggest thing that Invitationals did for us was show how diverse the meta is. We already knew that the meta was, somewhat diverse just because we had had 10 decks at Worlds the year before. We went from having 10 different decks at Worlds to having something like 17 different sets represented at Invitationals. Again, it's a different event. It was more experimental. Not everyone was playing the thing that they were most comfortable with or the thing they were necessarily best with. But the fact that we had a major tournament, or something in the vein of a major tournament, featuring the best players in the world, and we didn't even see an Attack on Titan list in the top 8, but we did see a bunch of other things. I think that was the biggest takeaway from this tournament. Not even necessarily that Fate won. The fact that Fate won is significant because it's such a new set, but the fact that the top 8 was as diverse as it was, I think that's the most interesting thing to take away from Invitationals.
So as we look forward past that, in the midst of the tournament happening, Bang Dream got an expansion pack, I'll call it that, that it gave it more tools and more support to allow it to continue to be a presence wherever you may go.
We're going to see Bang Dream forever. So, Bang Dream will never not be relevant just because they're just going to keep printing Bang Dream, which is fine. That's fine. It's a Bushiroad product. It's a Bushiroad licensed product. It makes sense for them to continue to print it, and they do a good job diversifying it. So different bands have different decks, and you've got to deal with it. It showed up at Worlds last year, and it wouldn't surprise me if it showed up at Worlds next year.
Fair enough. Next up on the list was that time I got reincarnated as a slime.
Yep, and this is where I think that when we look back at 2020, I think that this is the set that is going to be the most relevant long term in terms of the meta.
Yeah, it's at least a point that we can pinpoint and say, hey, look, things started to change slightly here.
Yeah.
I think we can do the same thing with Goblin Slayer, honestly, because we could see that the wall deck begin to kind of solidify that there was typically a wall deck that you were going to face off at some point in some fashion. And see that repeated with Fujimi. I think with this one, with Slime, this is kind of the inclusion of that hyper memory as well as that hand encore early play stuff.
This set made memory compression cool again in a way that it hasn't since Angel Beads. So it's got a lot of pieces. Obviously, the level 1 memory combo, the level 0 that sends itself to memory. There's a lot of memory stuff here. It has an early play healer with hand encore that's really powerful. Slime is very good, and it's getting more support. No date release yet. I don't even think it's technically been announced for English, but it's coming to English.
It has not been announced for the English. We see that it's getting support. Fun fact, it's getting released in JP the same day English is getting Data Live. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, but I think that's going to be another pinpoint day. But with that kind of idea, the early play heal, the idea that You're able to get these early plays in and keep them on field. You're able to, especially with that memory compression, like it in many ways changes how decks are played kind of from this point forward a little bit.
It alters the game. It alters the way that Weiss is played in the English meta, because it sets a new threshold for what compression can be.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it used to be that being, 1 out of 3 was about as good as you could possibly get. Well, with Slime, it is entirely possible to have a deck that is 1 out of 2.5. It's like now, like it sets a higher ceiling for how good compression can be.
Mm-hmm. It also allows the opportunity to potentially force your opponents to play differently into it.
There's a lot to deal with in this set, and there are enough finishing pieces, fortunately, for everyone who doesn't play Slime. Slime was not given an oppressive level 3 combo, which we all appreciate. But there are enough pieces there so that Slime can close games, which is something that a lot of other decks that play defense, they struggle to close games. Slime, not as much. It doesn't have an over-the-top finishing combo, but it does have an end game. So that puts it on a different level. A deck like this that can close a game is a lot more dangerous than one that just stays alive indefinitely. And with Slime 2 coming out probably in English fall of 2021, it's not technically guaranteed yet, but I would be shocked if we did not get Slime 2 in English at some point in 2021.
Right.
I think that would be absolutely surprising. So Slime is good right now. It's relevant right now. I would say if it's not, S tier, it's at least A tier. And it has the potential to not only remain in A tier, but bump itself up into being in the very top of the meta with a good Slime 2 release next year. So Worlds 2022, the Worlds tournament that takes place in Japan in January of 2022, who knows? I don't know if 2021 is going to be Slime's year, but 2022 could very much be a big year for Slime if it gets the support it needs in Slime 2. And now we're talking about, a meta that's over a year away. So let's move on to talk about Memory Snow.
Yeah, Memory Snow came out. It is essentially trait locked. It's not quite, but it's close enough.
Yeah.
A lot of pieces you'd want to attack into ReZero don't play well with non-Memory Snow pieces. So, but it definitely, as it came out, it definitely had a lot of tools to be able to answer a lot of the stuff going on in the meta, being that anti-burn ones, being that the finishing combo that allows you to essentially clock climaxes. It gave you a lot of opportunities to affect your opponent's compression that way. It felt like a very anti-meta deck, a deck that was designed to answer other decks.
Yeah, and I think that ultimately the knock on Memory Snow is that while it is good at shutting off other things, it doesn't feel like it has its own identity other than stopping other things.
Yes.
It's got the primary finisher is that Icy Tail combo, which is okay. It's not bad, but it's not the explosive kind of top end that a high level meta deck needs. And it does feel like more and more, especially like the anti-burn one, is becoming less and less relevant as Attack on Titan becomes less and less the dominant meta deck.
Well, I think part of the issue that the Memory Snow runs into is that the top end of feels like it's more of a two-turn end as opposed to one. But the finisher doesn't heal.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't give it the time to develop that two-turn ending that it needs.
That makes sense. Yeah. I don't know if there's as much room for the two-turn end game at the top of the meta these days.
No, I'm not saying that there necessarily is. I recognize that the idea of clocking the climaxes as you're going is nice, but it's not really effective until you get into that next deck.
Yeah.
So, which it's trying to mill out. I mean, you go through, if you're doing a triple rem top end, you're going through 15 cards and then swinging hopefully another 6 depending on cancels and whatnot. So you're going through that's if you do hit all 6, 21 cards,
Yeah.
which is effective, but at the same time,
Hmm.
to be able to take advantage of clocking a climax, you have to get to that next turn.
Yeah.
Unfortunate for Memory
Yeah.
Snow. I guess even more unfortunate after that Nazarick Tomb of the Undead. As everyone calls it, Overlord. Unfortunately for that deck, coming out several years after it got released in JP.
Yeah. And it plays like it.
It does.
Was Overlord the worst set released in 2020? Is Overlord worse than Jojos? Like, no offense to anybody who likes playing Overlord or playing Jojos. Like, play what you want. The game's supposed to be fun. So play what you want. However, Overlord was not competitive from the second it dropped. And there's nothing wrong with that, but calling a spade, it just wasn't competitive.
Coming in a little bit behind. It's
Yeah.
like
And it's got some stuff. Like, it's not all bad.
no, it's not.
It's not like, it's not like they just like re-released Fairy Tale. Like it's got some stuff. It's just outdated.
Yeah, and coming in outdated right before
Mhm.
Konosuba, in between Slime and Konosuba, I think doesn't help it any.
And I also think it's really funny that, it didn't even get the decency of being called its own name, but had to change its name because of some movie that nobody saw that had the copyright in the United States for some reason.
That is the working theory. They have never actually specifically said why.
Unfortunately for Nazalord, Untomb of the Overic, kind of dead on arrival. But honestly, it kind of gave the meta a little bit of a breather after like absorbing slime and like trying to learn how to deal with slime. And right before probably the most important set of 2020 dropped, which was of course Mob Psycho 100. I'm kidding. It was it's Legend of Crimson. Konosuba. As much as like I'm a Konosuba fanboy, love the show, love the cards, love the whole thing. This actually is probably going to be a meta-defining set for a while. The old Konosuba stuff is still good. You could play the old like if this set never happened, you could still play the old Konosuba list, and it would still be a top tier list. Konosuba, I think, is the only set that has multiple potential S tier decks within it. What do you think, Brandon? Is that overstating, or do you think that that's accurate?
I think that it's one of the sets that actually I think has been done really, really well in regarding like you have a variety of different options and pieces to play what you want to within the set. Like for
Yeah.
example, if you wanted to play with Megamine, you're playing Megamine. If you wanted to play with Darkness, you're playing Darkness. If you wanted to play with Aqua, you at least have a top end.
Yeah, there are probably like if you look at this, right? If you just take Konosuba and look at it, there are at least 4 decks that are competitive level. And that doesn't count the ones where you're mixing and matching a bunch of pieces. The new Salvage is good, the new Aqua is good, the new Darkness is good, and of course the old Megamine is good.
I think one of the things that it also has that's worth noting, it has memory hate in it.
It does.
Um, within the set, and I think that that's going to be worth noting going forward.
Yeah.
Because that immediately it answers slime pretty quickly, but at the same time, like it also allows answering for some of the things that come beyond that. It allows gatekeeping regarding memory compression.
Yeah. It keeps memory compression honest, hopefully. The only thing that sucks about it is that it's on the least played color, yellow.
Mm-hmm.
There's much more yellow in the deck than there used to be. Still, the fact that it's on a yellow 1/1 event and it requires the presence of Worst Boy Kazuma on your field, that hurts. Like if anti-memory wasn't so important, I would say that it wasn't particularly playable, but you might just need to find a way to jam it in. Depending on how important memory compression becomes, for every set coming after Slime. So, because obviously, Adventure Time has it. There are other sets that are coming out that we anticipate are going to, be working more with memory compression. So, don't know. We'll see. We'll see what happens. But in the meantime, Konosuba has, pun fully intended, an explosive top end. It does a lot of damage. It decompresses really effectively. Its level 1 combos are probably its weakest point, but I think that there are ways to make them work effectively. I think that there's enough synergy there. I think the more I've been experimenting with the 5-3 list and using the gate climaxes or in like a gate salvage 4-4 kind of thing, like the more I agree with the people who are saying that it's going to be the Konosuba list. I agree with that assessment at this point. But there's a lot to play in Konosuba. Like you said before, like if you want to play Darkness, the Darkness list is actually really strong. And like the Darkness list alone, like looking back through everything else that's been released this year, I would say the Darkness is stronger than at least 3, if not 4, of the top decks from full sets that were released this year. And the Darkness is like the 3rd deck in Konosuba right now. So like even the stuff that isn't necessarily meta in Konosuba is still really, really good. Link to Brandon's Darkness deck in the description, by the way. It's a good deck.
It's waifu. I mean, it's what it is.
Yes, but it's very good. And if you wanted to pivot off of that being, just a character deck and into utilizing all the best pieces, it's very easy to do that. A lot of the best Konosuba pieces have synergy with each other. There are a couple of cards from the first 2 sets that are staples in Legend of Crimson decks, but for the most part, like there's a lot to like about Legend of Crimson, and I think long term it's going to have staying power. So we'll see how it deals with Date Alive. I think that's going to be the big one. That's the big question. That's the big question for the whole meta. Like obviously, the specter of DAL hangs over this meta, but then we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's look at the last set released so far in 2020. Adventure Time. English exclusive.
Yeah.
It's pretty good, Brandon.
I mean...
You built this one too. Another link in the description. You also built Overlord. We're just going to link everything in the description. There are going to be a lot of links in this description.
I mean...
Mostly to videos. So like Overlord's in there. Adventure Time's in there. There's going to be a lot of Konosuba in there.
Adventure Time's been fun. So I've played with Ian a couple times, actually. Him playing Adventure Time, myself playing Slime. He's gotten the better of me twice now. It's a very interesting deck. There's a lot... Right now, I think right now it's still kind of in that testing stage. Like, people are still looking at and experimenting with a couple different options at level 1. The level 1 game, I would say, hasn't really been decided as like a true standard yet.
Yeah.
I think it's really difficult to say right now at that level 1 stage. But I think for the most part, everybody's kind of finalized on the Finn and Jake endgame being one of the strongest finishers in that set.
I think that, the general consensus based on what I'm hearing from people who are playing this set is that they're still trying to figure out which pieces to put together because there isn't a whole lot of natural synergy, but there's a lot of power here. There are a lot of really good effects. It's a matter of trying to figure out how to put all those effects together in a deck that actually works. Would you say that's accurate, resident Adventure Time player?
Adventure Time seems to be... It's a lot stronger than English releases have been.
The initial reaction to Adventure Time, I was really surprised by. Like, there were a couple of... Like, it kind of got previewed by a couple of places, and, like, the initial reaction was viscerally frustrated with it. At least that's what it felt like. Someone who's just kind of on the outside observing. You've been testing it against me for a while, and I was pretty impressed by the pieces, so I was really surprised by all of the kind of negative reactions it initially got. That seems to have calmed down in recent days.
I think part of the negative reactions were because it's not your traditional anime.
Yeah, I can see a little bit of gatekeeping there.
I suspect that was part of it. Another part of it as well is that because there's so much variety on that level one discussion right now,
Yeah,
that not having a formalized list makes it more and more difficult to play into, especially because all of those lists come with different climax options. It really forms the deck differently. And so not having a true set, this is how you play into this deck, makes it more difficult to play against.
yeah. Usually at level 1, it's like, okay, do I, it used to be when you were choosing a level 1, you were like choosing between, book and wind kind of thing, or like book and stock soul. And it was like, okay, fine, whatever, or maybe even standby. But now it's like, do I want salvage or choice? Like
Do I want
the level
salvage?
1,
Do I want choice? Or do I want a gate? Do I want an empty trigger?
it used to be like when you were deciding on your level 1 combo, it wasn't just about the trigger. It was like a pretty significant part of your decision was the combo itself. Like that was primarily what you were choosing, was the combo itself. And now it's like, because level 1 combos have been given more strong climax triggers, especially with the advent of choice, it feels like that decision's a lot more dependent on the trigger, because it doesn't feel like there's a whole lot of difference between draw and shot, but there's a huge difference between standby and choice.
I think Konosuba is our first choice, right? First choice trigger.
I think Konosuba was our first choice trigger. It feels like this year, with especially the back half of this year, the sets that have been released have had a lot more powerful level 1 triggers.
I think we've had a lot of powerful sets in a row that I think have made it really interesting to see.
Maybe it's just made it more noticeable.
I think that's what it is, because I would say that Adventure Time post release is a decently powerful set.
I would say it's really powerful. It has one of the most powerful top ends, I think, in the entire meta right now.
I would say that it definitely has a strong showing.
I think that it has a very consistent, very high damage floor. And like any end game that can almost guarantee a win when it swings in from 3-2 is pretty strong. It's really, really tough to keep Adventure Time from getting its damage. And ultimately, I think that's the reason that Adventure Time is going to be good long term.
I think it's definitely going to be a while before we see it disappear from at least some kind of tiered gameplay. There is one more set that is coming out this week.
Yes, there is.
Mob Psycho. So it's hard to say this one for sure because this one is still coming out yet. But we do see there are a lot of tools within Mob Psycho that allow for at least interesting builds. We'll see what this set actually does bring when it comes fully out. But like as we're kind of beginning to wrap up the year, we're not having. There's no competitive gameplay announced as of yet through the end of this month. So the likelihood that it happens is rather low. But we wanted to at least address that it's coming out, address that there are a lot of interesting pieces for this deck and set. At least make it relevant in some way. It's not coming in as an underpowered set.
In a lot of ways, much like Adventure Time, only perhaps more starkly.
Yes.
It has a very powerful end game, but a level 1 game that is still very much up in the air.
Yes. So, as we begin to look towards the end of 2020 completely, end of 2020 ends with the Mob Psycho, we have several sets in the docket to be released, which is fantastic. Some of the highlights, I mean, we have Grand Order coming out next month. We have ReZero booster pack, it adds in the inclusion of green now into the set. We have Magia Record coming in 2 different releases. That should help revive some of that Modica gameplay to make it actually a more relevant set.
Yep, and then of course when we get into March, the accursed Data Live will be coming to English without any restrictions or ban list.
Yep.
Because Bushiroad hates us, I guess. At some point, we'll be getting Magia Record, the anime version, which is going to be interesting to see how that does, given that the mobile game version will be released in February, and we don't have the mobile version in English anymore, so we'll see how that goes. Bofuri will come out after that. Heaven's Feel and Kaguya-sama slated for the summer. I think 2021 is about to be a very interesting year. I think circled in bright red marker is March 26th with the release of Data Live into English.
Yeah. It definitely feels like that's going to be a stepping stone into kind of that next level tier. I wouldn't be surprised if Data Live takes on a heavy presence in the local scene, if that makes sense. Maybe not even the local scene. It takes a heavy presence in gameplays.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if we were suddenly playing into a meta where 40% of the meta is playing Data Live. That wouldn't surprise me in the least.
It has been a strong set. And we saw it win JP Worlds pre-ban list for JP.
Mm-hmm.
We're getting unrestricted Data Live, so we have that same potential to have that similar list into English. English is a very different meta than JP.
Data Live is broken, and it's going to come into English broken. Unless it's restricted, Data Live is going to be broken on arrival in English.
We shall see how that affects when we get there. But I think there's going to be more of a tier going forward as we see how powerful Bofuri appears to be, and there's a lot of good things that could happen. There's a lot of things that yet to happen. A lot of those remain to be seen until we get there. So Bushiroad playing it by ear seems to be a rather good call.
Going into 2021, my biggest headline / question / thing to watch for is how Bushiroad decides to deal with more powerful things. They have decided to release Data Live as is unrestricted. In doing so, they have increased the power threshold in the English meta. They have increased the ceiling on English metagame power. Are they going to respond to that by making a bunch of things that are at that level? Or are they going to respond to it by introducing a ban list? Or, worst case scenario, they just let Data Live run rampant and don't print anything to counter it. All of those things are on the table. We'll see what happens.
I think also there's a potential that Data Live could be another boogeyman. The idea that
Yeah,
it seems bigger than it is, and then once it's in play, that it is not nearly as oppressive as initially thought.
that's the hope. Or it could become the next Attack on Titan, but worse. I don't know if you can tell, I definitely lean toward the latter. I think this set is absolutely oppressive. So we'll see what happens, but I'm not particularly excited about playing into DAL in 2021. We'll see what happens, though. A lot of cards need to be released before then, a lot of cards will be released after then, so it's a little too soon to be projecting too far into the future. But as things stand, 2021 at the very least is shaping up to be a very interesting year with a lot of interesting releases, a lot of really good cards, and, you know, hopefully a world championship at the end of it. We'll see what happens. But in the meantime, 2020 is just about done. We technically have one more Clock Talk in 2020, which will be out on the 29th. So this isn't exactly like a full year. I mean, it's a year in review, but it's not like the last show of the year. We'll be back in a couple of weeks for that. In the meantime, we'll have open gameplay on Thursday. Next Tuesday, Brandon's Mob Psycho list. The Thursday after that, we'll be testing that Mob Psycho list against some other stuff. Should be a lot of fun. We'll be back with another Clock Talk in 2 weeks. Until then, please like, share, comment, and subscribe, and have a good one.
We'll see you then.